Hi, and welcome to the Punk CX podcast. My name is Adrian Swinsko, and I'm an advisor, best-selling author, speaker, and general explorer when it comes to customer and employee experience. I'm really interested in figuring out what it takes to build organizations that produce better outcomes for both customers and employees. So with that in mind, I seek out and interview CEOs, entrepreneurs, business and tech leaders, authors and academics to uncover some clues about what it takes to build such an organization. Now, some of you may know the podcast as the Rare Business Podcast, but I decided to rename and rebrand the podcast recently. This is for a number of reasons. First one was to mirror the title of my book, Punk CX, which was published in June 2019. Two, because I'm a fan of punk music. And three, it's just more fun, right? Anyway, if this is your first time listening to one of these interviews, then hello and welcome. And please do dive into the archives at adrianswinsko.com, as I've now completed over 300 of these interviews in the last few years. If this is not your first time listening, then welcome back and thank you. Anyway, that's enough for me right now. Let's get into the interview. So welcome to the next edition of the podcast. Today I'm delighted to introduce you to Katherine LaVelle, who is Managing Director of Accenture Strategy, Talent and Organization in North America. Hi, Katherine. How are you doing?
I am terrific. Thank you so much for having me, Adrian.
You are very welcome. I'm excited to have you on the show. So, Katherine, to fill us in a little bit, for the benefit of our listeners and some of the readers, people who read the highlights of the interview, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Sure, certainly. So I work with Accenture Strategy, a management consultancy, and the area that I specialize in is working with organizations, typically very large organizations, on their workforces and their organizations and how to get the most out of both. And certainly with all the changes that are happening in the world right now, a lot driven by technology and other pressures, there's a lot changing in people's jobs. And when we think about what the future workforce will require, it's a question on everybody's mind. And that's what I spend a lot of time helping companies think through and address.
Perfect. And it's with that sort of that focus in mind, that's one of the reasons why we organize the time to have a chat on the podcast, because you recently published some new research called New Rules for Engagement Report, which talks about lots of different things. But before we dig into it, I wonder if you can give us a bit of an overview about the research and some of the main findings before we kind of start to dig into it.
Sure, happy to. So we set about to understand what is really driving the C-suite and what's important for them to get right. And we found some really interesting things. First, we looked at who influences the C-suite, and I'll get into that, but we found a group of people we're calling Pathfinders that influence businesses' leadership in new and different ways. And then second, we looked at what does it take to really relate to that group, and found that C-suites aren't really always very well prepared to do that, and as well as to engage with all the different stakeholders and types of pressures they've got today. So then we looked at what types of skills are behind that gap, and what do they need to do to close some of that gap.
Okay. I mean, so that's interesting, because that's one of that you're sort of alluding to one of the things I really wanted to dig into. I mean, just to give people a bit of a flavor of the research. Obviously, we don't want to go through it verbatim, because if people want to go and find it, then it's easily findable, and we'll point people in the right direction towards the end. But the first thing I wanted to ask you about was this idea of reskilling, because you talk about reskilling the C-suite. Now, I thought that's a really interesting idea, because it's normally an idea that's associated with the workforce in general. When we talk about big changes and things, people are like, oh, we have to reskill. It's a bit like kind of retooling in
Right.
like a manufacturing sense. But you're actually talking about the idea that you need to reskill the C-suite, is almost as if implying that there is a danger that the C-suite may be getting left behind within some of the broader changes that are going on, both in the environment and also in their organization. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. Nobody is immune from constantly reinventing and updating their skill set all the way up to the C-suite. And what we're suggesting is that leaders really have to embrace a balanced leadership approach, so that they're looking at blending what we traditionally refer to as left brain skills and right brain skills. And so while in the past they've been great at skills that we think of as left brain skills like finance, technology, and engineering, they have some work to do on topics like empathy, self-awareness, intuition, and that's where we're talking about the reskilling.
Right. Okay. So that's kind of, it's almost a bit like, it's one of those, it reminds me of this. It's in the book, actually, in the new book that I produced, the Punk CX book. And there's a quote from a Scottish poet called Robert Burns. And he talks about, there's this quote that says, what power the gifted give us to see ourselves as others see us. And the quote, what that says is that we almost think that we imbue people with kind of like divine powers if they have the ability if they're empathetic. Because what it implies is that empathy is really, really hard to do, to see things from other people's perspective. And I guess that there's a lot of talk about this, an empathy deficit between companies and customers, between governments and their citizens, and so on and so forth. And it sometimes gets brushed aside as being in air quotes, a soft skill, as it were. But actually, it's one of those soft skills that's really hard. And I guess that's a big challenge for leaders.
It is. There's certainly, I've noticed kind of a resurgence of the topic of EQ in business. So empathy is certainly a big part of that. And we found that, in our research, we had a full 65% of the C-suite population say that type of skill set is their very weakest.
Right.
And actually only 8% of that population said that they brought a whole brain approach, meaning those right brain side skills as well. So as I said, the empathy, the intuition, the relationship building. So it's absolutely difficult, according to this group, and they self-acknowledge that they need to work harder to build those skills.
Perfect. So I tell you what, let's come back to that, actually, because that's really interesting. But I want to go back to as well something that you alluded to. You mentioned these people called Pathfinders. There are these influential kind of groups, but actually the Pathfinders are one of 4 different groups of customers, employees that you've identified. The agitators, disenfranchised, the indifferent, and the Pathfinders that you have identified in the report. Now, I was a bit like, ooh, I like a classification. And so, because it's almost like a narrative, right? You can talk about and go, oh, does that make sense? Can I apply that here? So can you tell me briefly about each of these groups and who they are, why they're important, and particularly the last one, this Pathfinder group that's this newly emerging group from your research that are the ones that we really have to start paying attention to?
Sure. So first, it might help if you envision 2 different scales of a classic 2x2 matrix because they intersect. One being empowerment, so low empowerment, high empowerment.
Okay.
And the second being, on one end, on the left-hand side, a focus on the individual, and on the right-hand side, a focus all the way over to, let's say, society. So we were really looking at what groups of people, where do they fall in terms of feeling both empowered, and whether they're concerned with their own personal self-interest or they're concerned on a larger scale about the outcomes for society in general.
Right.
So using that scale, we plotted where people fell based on our research and the research of thousands, several thousand employees that we surveyed and hundreds of C-suite executives that we spoke with. And so as a result of that, we came up with, as you said, the 4 different groups. And so the groups we came up with were agitators, disenfranchised, indifferent, and Pathfinders. Agitators are self-empowered and believe they can change a company, but they're only interested in the values that benefit themselves. So
Right.
They're high empowerment and they're focused on individually, not on society.
Right.
The indifferent are on both the low sides of the spectrum. They lack self-empowerment and they only value what benefits them.
Right.
And disenfranchised don't feel very empowered, but they do value what benefits society. So the surprising thing for us was that a full 30% of people, and this was both employees and consumers because we spoke with both.
Right.
And a full 30% fell into the group that we called Pathfinders. And this is a what we're calling super group of employees and customers that have the motivations and perceptions of self-empowerment when they deal with companies that they work for and buy from. So they are highly empowered, and they believe they are acting and kind of have the responsibility to do the best for society. So it's pretty remarkable, I think, in terms of both their characteristics and influence. These are the people that have absolutely no qualms writing to the CEO of a company. I think about my clients who said, can't believe, a little bit different take, but I had a CEO who said, the millennials just keep coming at me. They keep scheduling time on my calendar. They think they can show up at my office. Now, what we found with our research was actually that this was not age specific, gender specific.
Right.
It really transcended all of the ethnographic characteristics we usually look at. But interestingly enough, we found this Pathfinder group is really, really important because they are your highest performing employees, and they are your customers that have more disposable income and are willing to spend much more on your products.
Right.
So that makes them a very important stakeholder group.
And so, and what about the distribution? So if Pathfinders are both sort of 30% of both customers and employees, I mean, how does it split across? How does the remaining population split across the other three categories, particularly from an employee perspective?
Well, I don't know that I saw the split between customers versus employees. And it was, I think the lowest piece was the disenfranchised, but the rest were fairly evenly split. There wasn't a large proportion of the population in any one of the categories. So it was a bit of a scattergram.
Oh, okay. No, but so I guess the most important finding is that actually these Pathfinders, they're a big lump, and we've got to pay attention to them. And it's almost a bit like this iceberg just showed up and we need to do something about it.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And so, because then going back to what you were talking about, this idea about taking this whole brain approach and then sort of being confronted by this group that needs, I guess, addressing of some sorts. Can you kind of explain what you mean by the whole brain approach and what that means in terms of for leaders and particularly how they engage this group?
Certainly. So just kind of creating the bridge between the two. So Pathfinders, first of all, expect different things from leadership. They really have a clear view of what they think are important skills, how they expect to relate with their most senior leaders in companies and in their employers. And they expect this kind of well-balanced set of skills from that group. They're, in many cases, less impressed with the financial statements, the data, the technology capabilities that C-suites have demonstrated for years. And instead, they expect leaders to be able to navigate all of the pressures that they've got. So economic, technology, geopolitical environments. They want leaders to be able to talk about all of those things, but also their individual concerns. And so if you think about that as the backdrop, and not just with Pathfinders, but we know that our leaders of companies today have incredible amounts of compressive disruption, all of these pressures we've talked about. They have to be able to pull together the set of skills that they need in any given situation to relate to a stakeholder of the day. And if you use these Pathfinders as the stakeholder group that we're talking about, they have to be able to relate they meaning the C-suite, has to be able to relate in a very personal way and in an individual way at the drop of a hat. You know what social media is like, and the minute somebody tweets out a complaint about a company, sometimes a very serious complaint, somebody's got to be able to respond in a meaningful way that addresses the issue, or it can quickly spiral out of control.
Sure.
So this means that this C-suite has to be able to relate, listen actively, understand the situation and the issue that's being communicated, and then communicate in such a way that the stakeholder, the employee or customer that's talking with them feels like they're really heard and like their issue is going to be addressed. And that's not something senior executives are very used to. They're, the ones that I've worked with have had the opportunity to iterate and reiterate their messages many times before it's released, review drafts and drafts of materials. And this new world requires them to kind of, act on a dime with the right set of skills in the moment.
Do you think that's possibly asking too much?
Well, I don't know if it's too much, but it is the reality, right? It is the reality. And I think, we found there's certainly ways for senior executives to build these skills, even if they didn't grow up with them. And by the way, a large majority said they did not grow up learning these skills. And if you look at their university and educational backgrounds, they're in topics like finance and technology and business. So not that big a surprise. And also given the fact that in I'll say the old world where information didn't flow as fast, they were probably somewhat isolated from the masses. They had other people who dealt with that. And so these are rare skills for this group. But I don't think, now that I consider your question a little bit more, I don't think it's too much to ask for most C-suites, because we know there are things they can do to actually build those skills.
I mean, and what are some of those things? Because if we're also going to look back to the whole sort of thing around empathy and EQ and everything else, I mean, it's all very well going and taking a course about EQ, but it's like you've also got to go. It's a bit like kind of reading a book about athletics, right? It's not you're not going to read a book about athletics and then become a world-beating kind of like sprinter, right?
Run the marathon the first time you decide you want to do that.
Exactly.
That's very true, and it's you are reminding me of the work I am fortunate to get to do with a lot of C-suites. So it is, biting off behaviors and skills piece by piece, chunk by chunk, and working on them. And there's a few things we think that you can do to accelerate your progress in this area. And then you're right, the other part is discipline and kind of building up that empathy and EQ muscle as you go, and working on that on an ongoing basis. So a couple of things that can kind of maybe jumpstart that skill set in a C-suite. One is to mix it up, bring in talent from outside, somebody that has the skill set in a big way.
Right.
And often we've found very entrepreneurial talent has this. Companies, startups, the high-tech industry, and people who have led startups have had to relate and, act very quickly to their stakeholder groups. So I've seen, for instance, I work with large financial institutions as my client base, and I've seen more and more of them bring in at the C-suite level, which used to be unheard of, but now bring in executives from very different industries. And those industries tend to be either high-tech or consumer goods retail brands who are practicing some of the things you mentioned in your book, Punk CX.
Right.
So they can really kind of mix things up and bring new energy and new ways of looking at things. The second is we're saying, you know what, you can really harness the power of this group that we've identified, the Pathfinders. So instead of just working in the C-suite, making decisions and analyzing information on your own, actually embrace that group, extend your decision-making process to include them, have things like representative groups from different levels in your company come into the C-suite and talk to you about issues and, perhaps research something for you so that you're getting the direct viewpoint from this Pathfinder group without it passing through 3 layers of management to be distilled and refined into nice bullet points.
Yeah. So I think
those are a couple of things that can.
I think that's absolutely right. I think the one thing I would also add to that, which sort of it strikes me doesn't happen as often as it might, is that for the C-suite to not as an organized thing, but almost to do it as like a habitual thing that they themselves do, and that's to sort of get out amongst your people, whether that is your employees or your customers, not in a managed theatrical sort of way, but in just a case of just what's that old term that was, I think, popularized by Tom Peters back in the day? We talked about management by wandering about.
Right.
Right, just kind of like put some shoes on and go wandering about.
No, I think that's an excellent point. And you remind me, I had a particular client who last year, when they had their top 300 executives together, they asked, how many of you have met with a customer first and last week, last month, last year?
Yeah.
And the most senior management was shocked to find out that most of them had not done that. And then they brought in customer service reps who shared some of their stories, and they asked, who of this group has talked to any of our customer service reps to hear what the customers are saying? Again, crickets. I then went to their conference this year, and it was dramatically different because they had put in a number of different formal initiatives to do exactly what you're talking about, managed by walking around, which, is kind of ironic that it takes a formal initiative to tell you to walk around and talk to your customers and see what's happening and talk to your employees. But certainly they did see the value in that.
Who knew that would be an incredible source of insight and connection?
Right.
Who knew?
Actually, talk to the people that buy your products and the people that do the work for your company.
Wow. But also the other thing about the research, which I thought was found quite interesting, which sort of makes it more complicated, particularly if you're working in an organization that has global kind of reach, is that actually the demands and the requirements in terms of this whole brain approach, and also the requirements that Pathfinders are looking for, or the sort of the skills and attributes that Pathfinders are looking for, it changes across geography as well, doesn't it?
Well, right. And, all the more importance of being able to flex, because at least my clients don't work in one geography. They're global leaders of global companies. And so, certainly we did find that Pathfinders, I want to be clear, Pathfinders existed across all the geographies in the same level of percentage. But sure, certain concerns and interests are very different by society, by geography, as we well know. So, and I most of my clients, I know when I try and get on their calendars, that day he's going to be in Asia, the next week they're in Europe, and I wait till I can get on their schedule when we're both in the same country at the same time. Yeah. So yes, these C-suite leaders are having to have their finger on the pulse of every single different societal topic and interest area and be able to respond in a meaningful way.
But so not to kind of like make people feel sort of disheartened or subdued by these findings, but it's by making them think that this is an impossible task. It's just that it's harder and more complex than we possibly assumed.
Well, I really have a lot of empathy. Speaking of empathy, I have a lot of empathy for what C-suite leaders go through, because it's everything we've just talked about. But we also know, and I'm sure your listeners are familiar with the compressing technology maturity curves. So the S curves have become much steeper and much close together. And we know from our research, we actually had 85% of the C-suite say they have a disruptive impact of technologies, and that it's increased dramatically. 75% of them were dealing with shifting customer demands. The majority said they've got new market entrants, so the idea of market disruption is huge pressures for them. And their investors are some of their most disruptive stakeholders. So yes, it's a lot for C-suites to deal with. And you're right. I don't mean to sound like doom and gloom. I've actually found, and I'm very impressed with C-suites that work on building all of these skills. They can handle all of this, but it's you better not just rest on your laurels. Like I said, no one is immune from building their skills and advancing, with the times. Well,
absolutely. But I think the other thing we need to kind of highlight as well is that your research found that when organizations and C-suites embrace this challenge and develop these new sort of skills, that has a real impact on the organization's growth and profitability, right?
Totally. So we actually looked over a 3-year period and found those that adopted a whole brain leadership approach, our terms, not their terms. Yeah. But when they really brought to bear all of those skill sets, they had a higher revenue of about 22% and 34% higher profitability over that 3-year period. And so, also not surprisingly, C-suites are onto this. And we had a full 61% say they're already taking action to start looking at the future. And the majority also said they have active plans to start building these skills within the next 1 to 3 years.
That's perfect. I mean, that's kind of that shows you what the prize is like, at least.
It's a pretty significant prize.
Yeah, no, indeed. So, I mean, thank you for that, Katherin. That's great. I mean, that kind of lays out the, I feel like lays out the challenge, but also kind of what the reward kind of might look like.
Yes.
If people wanted to kind of dig into the report in a bit more detail, I mean, am I right in saying we should just direct them to Accenture.com and then whole brain leadership? Would that be the best way to find it?
Accenture.com/whole brain leadership.
Fantastic. And so is there anything else that came out of the research that we sort of haven't sort of covered that you'd like to highlight, that you think this is a really important standout point?
So maybe one point we didn't cover, and I mentioned to you some things you could do to quickly infuse some of that whole brain thinking into your organization. But to your point, you don't just get up and run the marathon one day.
Sure.
So how do you day by day think about and start working on building those skills? And so, this is kind of not surprising given the convergence of other business trends like using agile methods. And so if you think about companies need to act quicker than ever before, and they need to be able to change on a dime depending on what their customers and constituents are telling them. Actively working to build C-suite skills by changing the way you're working and being more agile and being more comfortable with shifting gears and changing direction is really important. And so I mentioned that I have the privilege of working with a lot of C-suites on staying competitive. And one of the things that we work on is how do you act like a market disruptor when you're a large, typically monolithic company?
Yeah.
And so what behavior changes are required to act quicker, to sense and make decisions and learn. So test and learn, test and learn. And, I think about Amazon, who on any given day is running 150,000 different experiments and tests. And learning from them, obviously through a great deal of technology support. How do big companies learn to act like that? And that requires this whole brain leadership as well. So one of the things that I get to do with clients is actually think through just starting with the way they meet and the way they execute their work as a group of C-suite executives. How are they going to make decisions differently? How are they going to communicate differently? How are they going to take some risks within some managed risk borders that won't, risk the company?
Sure.
So I do think, the point I guess I'd want to stress is that building whole brain leadership skills and the right brain leadership specifically, is totally possible, but it requires you to think and behave differently day after day after day. So undertaking small challenges, micro learnings that we sometimes call them, different ways of working, studying your disruptor competitors and how they work and starting to take on some of their attributes. All of those things can be remarkably helpful in starting to build some of these skills.
So if I was to push you on that and say to you, that's great, but but within that, have you seen kind of one or two things that you think that's just really, really simple to do, but it can be very effective? I mean,
one that comes to mind is a lot of C-suites, they save the big decisions till they all get together. And, they collectively require consensus. So one thing they can do is be more comfortable with smaller groups making decisions and then everybody standing behind those decisions once you trust your colleagues to make them. So instead of 12 senior executives deciding on something, it's 2 or 3 in a smaller working group decide, and then, the other group test the ideas, make sure they've thought of things, gives their input, but goes with the recommendation of that group. So that's one very quick thing that organizations can do that I find they don't do very naturally.
Okay.
And the other piece, you kind of alluded to this with management by walking around. I would say actively seek out input from employees at all different levels. And I don't mean through formal listening strategies and surveys. I mean, go talk to people in your business, especially if you're the CFO, talk to, the summer intern, talk to the person that, that came over from another company. And so one of the ways that companies are doing this is just having executives have a brown bag lunch or a host a breakfast where anybody can sign up and just no agenda, let's just talk. So I think that's another thing companies can put into place very easily.
Well, I think so. I think there's it's a bit like it's sort of like get out from behind your desk and out of your office and behind your computer and out of meetings and things and actually go. I mean, we talk about go to where your customers are to better serve them. Then if you want to better serve your employees and therefore better serve your customers, you might want to go to where your employees are.
Makes perfect sense. And you remind me, and being a customer experience fan and guru, you will relate to this. We say that employee experience has all the same tenets and characteristics of customer experience. So what you say, your point stands to argue. Go to where your employees are and you'll learn a lot about them.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Well, right. So some really concrete sort of like things, which is great. So thank you for that, Katherin. So just to kind of like to wrap up, I mean, I've like you alluded to my book, Punk CX. One thing I've been asking kind of people, or a couple of things I've been asking people about just to get their take on it, is because it's a piece of ongoing social research. I'm creating this almost like not a word cloud, but like a phrase cloud. That I've been asking them, is there kind of one or two words that they would use to describe what they think a punk approach to customer experience would be? I mean, it'd be great to get your opinion on that.
Yeah, I certainly loved reading the examples in your book and thinking about this topic. And two for me, so I'm going to go for two just because you gave me the opportunity.
There you go.
The one word that jumped out at me throughout was emboldened. Right. I love that the companies just don't take the traditional approach, don't do what everybody else recommends, but they're emboldened more so than empowered. But, they're bold about what they want to, about their product, about their mission, about their target audience, all of it. Mm-hmm. So emboldened is one. And then eye-catching, because I found myself thinking about a number of different companies that I would say ascribe to, Punk CX as you described it in the book. And almost all of them are eye-catching to the point where if I'm walking through a store aisle, literally will catch my eye for a certain reason.
Right.
Or in many cases, no longer a store aisle, let's say an Amazon aisle.
Yeah. I mean, I think they're two. I mean, those are two great words, and actually not words that have been mentioned before. I mean, they're close to some other words, but not the same. So I'm going to make a note of those and use them. But and now I know that you can't talk about specific companies or brands because you work with kind of a whole bunch of people. Because my second question is normally about what company or brand do you think epitomizes the Punk CX ethos? Sure. Now, I know you can't talk about specific kind of companies or brands, but do you think there's a particular, say, sector or area that you think is sort of embracing more of a punk sort of approach to this than others?
I do. And, so I'll just put it out there. I think that the retail sector of consumer goods is really leading the way in this area. And if I go back to, a lot of them go back 5-8 years, a lot of companies were really forced to think differently about everything they did, given the Amazonification of the world and the threats to the market. I love what's become of that whole market segment. And you're right, I wouldn't name names, but when you think about entirely new products and distribution models for things like eyeglasses, socks, men's razors, those are organizations that really really broke through market rules and created new ways of doing things. And the other groups that I tend to be impressed by in that segment are purpose-driven brands and products. And, I really like there's a number of cosmetic companies that have, that benefit, they make sure they give a portion of their earnings back to women, and everything they do is about helping women who are homeless or in underprivileged areas. Yeah. I noticed a spirits company that said I think it was the vodka brand for dog people. And it was just that they associate their causes with their brand. And so purpose-driven brands, I think, have been also really, I'll say, punk in their customer experience. Perfect.
I mean, I think you don't need a PhD in consumer brands to probably figure out kind of who you're talking about. But we'll leave it at that. Katherin, I just want to say thank you for sharing some insights around the new rules for engagement report that you published, and kind of digging into it with me a little bit. We'll make sure we will kind of get all that linked up and point people to the report so they can take a deeper look at it. But lastly, just want to say thank you for sharing your time and your insight with us today. That's been brilliant.
Well, it's been absolutely a delight, Adrian, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. So thank you.
Well, that was cool. I hope you enjoyed it. I did, and I always do actually, because I always learn something new when I speak to some of these amazing kind of people. And it's always something new that I can incorporate into my writing, speaking, workshops, and other sort of advisory work that I do. Now, if you're interested in learning about any of that sort of stuff, then you can find out more about how I work with clients over at adrianswinscoe.com. But one final thing before I go, please consider heading over to iTunes or Spotify or whichever podcast platform you choose to use, and do leave a review. Every little helps, as we say. Anyway, that's all for now. Thank you for listening, and do tune in again soon. All the very best. Cheers. Bye.